Yes, I've pivoted from writing and speaking and expertising on comics and graphic novels um, to, for numerous reasons we can get into, but writing about Jack Ruby, who I've been kind of obsessed with for about the past 12 years. And we can talk more about that. But Ruby, spoiler alert, I do not solve the case. If you're looking for somebody who knows all the answers, I'm not that guy. Um, but the questions I did have were, who was Jack Ruby? How did he fit in? Um, how did this really kind of bizarre Jewish guy end up changing history on live television in a way that we're still dealing with the repercussions of today? So that's um, and I guess the thing that a lot of biographers, at least me, I've written a biography of Stan Lee, I've written some other books. I guess what often occurs to me is, how am I like this person and how am I not like this person? How is this person like other people that I know, and how is he not like other people that I know? So those, and then just of course, how was this guy involved in setting in motion the things that give us the world we're in today? So that's sort of an
Yeah,
overview. Ken, did you want to?
yeah. I mean, this is great, and Danny and I are going to carry this on kind of as a conversation, and hopefully, some of you folks out there of different age and different questions, please put them in because Danny knows a lot about this. But I just wanted to start out because this is probably one of the most researched um, weeks or 3 days in human history. And before we get into it exactly, I think for context for everybody, Dan, if you could just kind of what's the dramatist personae? What were this just the brief broad strokes of what happened? I mean, we kind of there may be some people here who that weren't watching TV on that fateful day when this happened. So just set the stage for us a little bit. And I would ask our viewers, and we're going to try and do this. 1963 was a really long time ago. There weren't portable phones or the internet, or you didn't have a movie camera in your pocket. So why don't you set the stage, Danny?
Well, I mean, and that may fit into the this excerpt I want to read from the book, but it was 1963. It was the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just taken place less than a year before, where there were, missiles, possibly nuclear missiles, placed in Cuba by the Soviets, and it's a big face-off between Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR, and then they made a deal, but then that averted nuclear war. But that was still very much in the air. Cold War was in the air. The kind of civil rights movement was in the air, especially in Dallas, um, which Kennedy needed to win the election in '64 to get reelected. And so he decided to take a campaign trip and try to unite the feuding um, factions of the Texas Democratic Party, and and so that was scheduled for November 21st. He'd be in Fort Worth, and then November 22nd he would fly to Dallas, even though it was a very short drive, but it was much more dramatic to fly. He flew to Dallas and got into the motorcade, and then as he was heading towards a meeting with a lot of civic figures, including Rabbi Silverman, Rabbi Hillel Silverman, who plays an important part in Jack Ruby's story, was shot by, of course, most accounts believe it was Lee Harvey Oswald was at least one of the shooters. There
So
are people.
Danny, just to say, what time of day did this happen?
This happened at the 12:30 in the afternoon on Friday, November 22nd. Um,
Okay.
so Kennedy is shot and killed. He dies about an hour later at Parkland Hospital. And Jack Ruby was a burlesque club, a strip club owner. He also owned a country western club, um, and made it his business to be everywhere and know everything going on in Dallas for numerous personal and professional reasons. And so
And
Ruby,
had was Jack Ruby a native Texan, Dan?
Jack was from Chicago. He was from the Maxwell Street Jewish ghetto in Chicago, which later became a black ghetto. Now is knocked down and is part of, I think, maybe the University of Illinois. Um, and so Ruby,
So
yeah, I'm sorry,
go
Ken.
ahead.
Oh,
Well, go ahead.
Ruby.
Well, I was just going to ask what's going on in Dallas? Kennedy's shot. Um, what and
uh,
uh, what's happening in the town? You know, just
well,
how did Ruby
the town, there
hear
was a
about
lot.
this?
You know, it was a big deal for Kennedy to visit, even though Dallas was a large city. It was a big deal for the president of the United States to visit, and it was a very divided city, very polarized, if that sounds familiar, with right and left, liberals and conservatives, and uh, Kennedy, allegedly or maybe really said to his wife as they were descending, "We're heading into nut country now." That was his wisecrack to his wife, which he still, traveled. He was campaigning. He was on a charm offensive, and so he wanted. He didn't have any kind of bubble top or any kind of protective covering on his car. Um, so,
And how long after the shooting does it take for the police to apprehend the person who's the prime suspect?
that of course is an interesting question. It takes them less than an hour. Somehow they go from a description of like a average height, dark haired figure seen in the window of the book depository to it's Lee Harvey Oswald and he's in the movie theater. And along the way Oswald um, kills this officer Tippett, this cop who stopped to question him. As you know, everything I've just said has 10 counter stories. I've just given us a version that
Yeah,
many
but we know that he's shot in the afternoon. The guy's apprehended an hour later. He's in the pokey in Dallas, and Jack
right.
Ruby's skulking around.
Jack
So
Ruby is
then what
running
happens?
around. Jack Ruby is running around like a lunatic for 2 days. Jack Ruby is the most conspicuous figure in Dallas. He's everywhere. He's he's bringing sandwiches to the police. He's trying to sneak into the room where Oswald is being questioned. He's giving out business cards to reporters. He's gathering his staff members from his club and going out and taking pictures of what he considers evidence, like he is the private detective who's going to crack the case and solve the murder mystery. So and then of course just about 48 hours later, he kind of pops up out of the crowd of reporters and police and plugs Oswald with one bullet. Probably would have shot him more if he wasn't stopped.
So
So it's
this is sorry, Danny, just so that
sure.
we're clear because it's been a long. So this is Monday
This is
morning or
no,
Sunday morning?
Sunday morning. Friday,
Monday.
early Friday afternoon, just before a little before Shabbos, Kennedy is shot, and then on Sunday, about 11:20, Ruby shoots Oswald, and then
Right. And the Dallas police are gonna move Oswald, prime suspect, from one.
from from the Dallas jurisdiction to the county jurisdiction.
I want to interrupt you for one reason,
Yes.
because I'm getting somebody's got a comment here. He just wanted to note that given the nature of weapons in 1963, which is so different from today, that in order to kill a person, you had to put the gun right into the belly, just as Ruby did, noting that he knew how to kill somebody. So
Oh,
I
well, yes, he was a violent guy with a violent history, and both he and Oswald were trained to shoot weapons in the army.
So yeah, no, I mean, we'll get into more of the details on this as we go, but it's fascinating to just unplug this also based on the way the world works now. I mean, basically Sunday morning, you've got as I recall, and I don't remember it, but I was talking to a friend of mine, and maybe many people in the audience will remember. I mean, everyone in America on Sunday morning was like watching the transfer of Lee Harvey Oswald. If you can imagine every eyeball in black and white TV watching this, because I guess nothing else was on TV because they'd stricken all programming, and this was something to cover, and all the cameras were there. And then I guess, yeah, as you said, the famous shot of him like stepping out of the crowd and putting his pistol right in this guy's stomach. But this happens like in broad daylight.
Well,
Danny, just tell us a little bit about the moment and then what happened afterward.
well, not just in, I mean, it wasn't in daylight because it was indoors, but it was there were like 100 people in that basement. There were, reporters from every newspaper and radio and TV station in the world. They were, lined with police. It seems amazing that Ruby himself did not get shot. There are theories that he wanted, for whatever his motivation in killing Oswald, he must have kind of assumed. I get, I'm going to go to pop culture.
Does Oswald die on the spot? Does Oswald die on the spot?
Oswald dies 2 hours later at Parkland, like Kennedy died at Parkland. And
so
like
if, again, just one last thing, just for everybody to sit there. So you have the shock of the president being assassinated. Everyone's trying to cover with that horrendous act of public violence right away. And then right away, as maybe normalcy is going to be reestablished, you have a shot, one that's totally seen probably by almost every person in America live. Another one right there.
Of a guy who should have been the most heavily guarded person in the world, right? I mean, this was the prime and at that point only suspect in the murder of President Kennedy.
So just real quick, so we can get into your book. Then what happens to Ruby after the shooting?
Well, unlike Oswald, who didn't, for some reason, and this, to me, this is, a nagging point in my mind, but they did not seem to have a working tape recorder at the Dallas Police Department. So there is no recording of anything that Oswald said or that was said to him, leaving room for all sorts of speculation about what did or didn't happen, what he did or didn't say. Jack Ruby spent 3 years not shutting up. Jack Ruby spent 3 years talking, although he did not testify in his trial. I think they were afraid he would incriminate himself. He spent 3 years holding impromptu press conferences during breaks in the trial, talking to anybody and everybody who came to visit him. So certainly he was not somebody who was kept under wraps or kept from.
So he's there chilling for 3 years before the trial, and everyone in the world has witnessed
the trial happens very quickly. Actually, the trial happened quickly, and he's convicted quickly.
When he's sentenced. Yeah.
He's sentenced, but during the appeals period, he's still in prison. At one point he almost got out on bail, and then somebody realized, oh, maybe we shouldn't let this guy out on bail.
And just to wrap up the factual part, I assume, and he's charged with first-degree murder, and they say, yeah, we saw you do it on TV. You're guilty, and that's it. He's in the pokey.
Well, yeah. I mean, the question then is, it comes down to a matter of, was he, what was his state of mind? Was he legally insane? Yes, it was quite clear since millions of people saw him do it. But this is where Melvin Belli comes in. So I'll run through the history sort of.
Yeah. So So we've got the basic thing. So who was Jack Ruby? Who was he?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question. Ruby was from here. This is the Maxwell Street, kind of the Lower East Side equivalent in Chicago. I'm not sure what it would be in Cleveland. I know Glenville was a little more already, I don't know if I call it upscale, but it was like the Lower East Side of Chicago. This is the kind of the crushing poverty that Jack Ruby and overcrowdedness of this area, this Maxwell Street, which a lot of people came from. you may know Maxwell Street if you've seen the Blues Brothers movie, the scene where John Lee Hooker is playing. That's Maxwell Street, which at that point had become a black ghetto. But now that it's been torn down, and I think I think the University of Illinois has buildings there. The same neighborhood that produced Jack Ruby produced Benny Goodman, the band leader and the clarinetist. It also produced Barney Ross, who was, when boxing was a Jewish sport, Barney Ross was maybe one of the two most famous welterweight boxers. Boxing was so Jewish then that boxers who were not Jewish pretended they were. Barney Ross was
Danny,
born.
Yeah, my Bobby knew him. They went to school together on the West Side and there on Maxwell Street. He was a big star.
I should have talked to you.
Yeah, my mom was well, we talked about it. Yeah, the West Side, it got torn down and they all moved further west. But go ahead, yeah.
So he was born Beryl Rozovsky. He was a Talmudic scholar, but his father was killed in a robbery at the fruit and vegetable store they owned, and that kind of embittered him and just left him with no direction. So he was Jack Ruby's best friend, and both of them worked doing errands for Al Capone. Allegedly, according to Barney Ross in his memoir, that there was nothing important in the envelopes that they were delivering, but who the hell knows? But this, there was certainly proximity to gangsters for both those guys. Again, allegedly, certainly for Barney Ross, Capone said, "Get out of here, kid. You're too pure to be corrupted." But Ross had an interesting, complicated life. This is just Jack Ruby. So Ruby is in Chicago. He acts as a muscle for for Waste Handlers Union. He's in a room when the president of the union gets murdered. He's questioned, but Ruby has no convictions or even arrests for murder. He's spends his time leading up to the war beating up Nazis, breaking up Bund meetings with Barney Ross. So a very violent life, but probably not unlike a lot of people. Here he's in a quieter moment on leave. I don't know who the woman is, but Ruby at least had the pretense of a date, although what his sexuality was and is a debated topic. There he is at a bucolic scene with a canoe, in the country. Here he is with his younger sister Eileen and one of their cousins. He had a big family. His parents were out of their minds. His mother was in and out of institutions. Jack himself was in different foster homes, as were his siblings. There were 8 of them. There was a 9th who died in a horrible scalding accident. Ruby himself claimed or reported that he'd been dropped on his head. I would have to guess that his parents, both being very violent, there was probably a fair amount of abuse. There he is with his sister again, and it looks like in the late 40s. This is an interesting. There's a piece of footage that became available recently of just before the assassination of Jack at a parade in downtown Dallas, where a lot of his performers were entertaining on this parade. He was in show business, so not just the strip clubs. And he did love his dogs in some ways. Oh, there's a cat. I didn't even realize. He had maybe his closest relationships with these dachshunds. He would gift them to people, including the rabbi. Rabbi Silverman, I spoke to, and he just died about 6 months ago, and he shared his notes that he took when visiting Jack in prison with me, which were very valuable in research and just putting together a story. This is Abe Weinstein. He and his brother owned rival strip clubs. One was next door to, and one was around the corner from Jack's Carousel Club. So this is this is the subset of the community of the show business and the Jewish community of Dallas, with which Ruby was very much involved and very much a schmoozer and a glad hander, and for all the reasons you'd think, wanting to be successful with his clubs, maybe to be able to have a cover for criminal activities, wanted to be very involved. This is Stanley Marcus, the owner of Neiman Marcus, maybe one of the louder liberal voices in Dallas. I don't think Ruby knew him personally, but he was somebody who weighed in on the trial, whether or not, there was a lot of controversy about whether he could get a fair trial in Dallas at all. Dallas was so traumatized by what happened. This is a somewhat less reputable guy. This is Santo Trafficante, who was a convicted mobster in Cuba. And Ruby went on a trip to Cuba where it's quite likely that he brought money and or information from and to Trafficante in Havana shortly, both before, well, that would have been after the revolution in 1959. That is, I took that picture at Jack Ruby's shul at the Temple Shearith, Israel, and that was Hillel Silverman. He's the father of the actor Jonathan Silverman. If you've seen Weekend at Bernie's, Hillel is Jonathan's father. This is like one of just the strangest pictures I've ever seen anywhere. This is like the ultimate what if in Jack Ruby's life. Ruby was in show business, and I'll show you more of that. He came across this 12-year-old black kid whose professional name was Little Daddy Nelson. He was a song and dance wonder, and Ruby was his manager. Kid could very well have been successful, but then as he started having a little success, a second mother showed up claiming that the people claiming to be the kid's parents weren't, and then Ruby just kind of was shunted aside or stepped aside. But this is one of the big what ifs in history, is what if Little Daddy Nelson and his pal Jack Ruby had been successful in show business? Tennessee. So Ruby ended up owning and managing a place called the Bob Wills Roadhouse, which became famous as the Longhorn Ballroom. People might know it as that, where everybody from Tennessee Ernie Ford, who's on the left there, famous for 16 tons. He was somebody who Jack Ruby was friendly, or at least worked with. Hank Williams, that's Hank Williams on the left. That's the guy who played Loki, who played him in the movie about Hank Williams. I'm blanking on the name, but somebody will know. Jack Ruby, the last person to give Hank Williams Sr. regular work, which didn't stop him that when Hank Williams would black out backstage, Jack Ruby would charge people to come backstage and take pictures of the unconscious Hank Williams. Tom Hiddleston, that's who the actor is. The band played for Jack Ruby just like 6 months before the assassinations, and Robbie Robertson in his memoir writes about this very strange guy, Jack Ruby, who employed them. This is the Bob Wills Ranch House, which Ruby managed. Gabe Kaplan auditioned for and has a very weird story that he tells. You may remember him from Welcome Back, Kotter. He's now a professional poker player. He had a very strange story about auditioning for Ruby and using a very mild obscenity, which I won't use here because I don't know what the rating is of this presentation, but Ruby basically flipped out and said to him, "You're trying to get me clothes? You think I run a toilet here?" And it was, like I said, a very mild obscenity starting with a T. And it's a very, this was Jack Ruby. This is a very weird world of Jack Ruby. This is him with a couple of his dancers in front of the carousel, which you can tell is maybe not the most high class venue in the world. It was in the rundown downtown section. It's where students came to party, business people came, where the high society came when they didn't want anybody to know. That's Ruby acting as his own MC, which he sometimes did. He also acted as his own bouncer. He would throw people out. He'd end up smashing their heads against the sidewalk, and then suddenly, come out of what his lawyer's lady claimed was a fugue state and going, "What am I doing? Why am I doing this? Who are you?" And then he would give them a pizza and $100 to not press charges. And perhaps there were other threats involved, but that's Ruby. And in his country western clubs, he would dress up in a white cowboy suit and call himself the Chicago Cowboy, and show up. This is a tamer shot of one of Ruby's dancers. This is from the piece of evidence in the Warren Commission report. This is Ruby with a comedian. I think that is that's Tammy True, I believe, but somebody can tell me correctly. On the sitting next to Ruby, that's Ruby on the left. So he just had this kind of strangely normal life with this. It could be a sitcom, you know, with these people he would have raging arguments with. He would hire them and fire them multiple times. This is Tammy True, who the Skyliner was the club where the band played, and she was one of Ruby's main dancers. She would later, you know, as we'll see, make a lot of her later career out of having been. She would perform with a burlesque review called the Conspiracy Club, and she was doing that till she died in her 80s just a few years ago. This is maybe the most famous dancer that worked for Ruby, a woman named Candy Barr, who had a checkered history of being abused, starred in what's considered the first porn movie, although not, it seemed like she was drugged and trafficked basically with her sometime boyfriend, Mickey Cohen, the Jewish gangster from Los Angeles. They were an item. Then she testified against him. Then she thought he was going to kill her. Then they were always forgiven. She was the one who Ruby gave a couple of dachshunds when she was down and out and needed to make some money. He gave her a couple of dachshunds so she could start a breeding business. But as she's quoted as saying, it didn't work. The dogs just didn't like each other that way. The night before Kennedy arrived in town, Ruby had dinner at the Campisi's Egyptian restaurant, which was, of course, an Italian restaurant. That's why it's called the Egyptian restaurant. He had dinner with a bunch of people, including Joe Campisi, who was probably mobbed up. Campisi's looks now as it did then, and it's now basically a mob theme restaurant, to the point when I was there. That's why this picture is so blurry, because I took it. But there was a picture of Al Pacino to Joe Campisi, from one Godfather to another. Ciao, Al Pacino. So it's, you know, there are places in Dallas that have been preserved as they were, and that's Campisi's. And then we get to the kind of the heart of the story. This is the Kennedys in the back seat, and Governor John Connally and his wife in the front. And they didn't know what the reception would be like. As I said, Dallas was very divided, especially with General Walker was really fanning hatred against liberals in general, Kennedy in particular. And this is just around the moment when Nellie Connolly turns to Kennedy and says, "You can't say Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President." Well, okay, this is a few minutes later, and this is a frame from the Zapruder film of Kennedy just having been shot and Connolly just having been shot. This is Arlen Specter on the right, the senator, the Jewish senator, who came up with what's been ridiculed as the single bullet theory or the magic bullet theory. He's here demonstrating how he thought that happened. Many people think it couldn't. It seems highly unlikely. But Specter stuck to that till the end of his life, and included it in the title of his memoir. And he had a very interesting role with Jack Ruby. And then there are two famous photos. This is the difference between what gets a Pulitzer and what doesn't. This is the shot just before Ruby. And look at them. Ruby is like 6 inches away, and nobody sees him. Nobody has any clue that this is about to happen. And this is how you get the Pulitzers, by getting at the moment of shooting. That of course is James Lavelle on the left, who was interviewed many times. But you can see the room is filled with reporters. I think that's one reason that Ruby probably did not get shot, was because the police were so traumatized. They didn't want to take a chance on shooting any. They didn't want to take a chance on killing a bunch of reporters. You know, Ruby is tackled. He's arrested, handcuffed. Despite this photo, of him looking so dispirited, he actually was joking around, and he had lost a part of his finger in a fight with a musician who had bit off the top of one of his pinky fingers, and he was joking about that with the guy fingerprinting him. So then it goes to trial pretty quickly. Some of these players you may know. Henry Wade was the lead prosecutor, who became even more famous as the Wade in Roe v. Wade. But all these different people. There's Lavelle again. So this is who said what when would become very important to Melvin Belli on the right, who was maybe the most famous lawyer in America at the time. This was a circus trial that was maybe comparable to the Chicago 8 trial, and so every celebrity showed up, and Belli, famous, Manfred Guttmacher he's from the Guttmacher Institute. That's the guy from the Institute. There's Rabbi Silverman. Barney Ross shows up as a character witness for Ruby. Ross had gone through his own hell with drug addiction and being, hanging out with, some actual criminals who exploited him. He died. Ross died 2 weeks after Ruby did in '67. So this is this surreal trial. Everything is very serious. Belli tries this very esoteric psychomotor epilepsy, which then got them in trouble with the people with epilepsy who came to protest. But Wade, who had never lost a murder trial, was intent on sending Jack Ruby to the electric chair. So I think, although people make fun of Belli for it, and Belli was an eminently lampoonable person, he tried this very esoteric thing because I think he just thought, that going with kind of crime of passion, which is everybody advised him to do, wasn't going to work with Henry Wade. Especially Wade was pissed off that he didn't get to try Oswald in some weird way. Ruby himself said this, and it seems like it was really true. People started thinking Ruby was on trial for Kennedy's murder. So here's one of, and this is sort of the not so lovable Jack Ruby. I think this is the side that if you were about to get your head slammed in the sidewalk or be shot by Jack Ruby, that's probably the face you saw. And that's Belli on the lower right. So this is Jack Ruby is you can't shut him up. The guy, whatever, but you also can't keep him consistent. He just talks and talks and talks. And yet, weirdly or not weirdly, nobody took a shot at him, despite the fact that he was on display for 3 years. And that's Barney Ross. That's a court sketch of Barney Ross testifying. I don't think I think it's more symbolic. I don't think he had the spider webs or the boxing gloves behind him. In the middle of the trial, there was a jailbreak because a bunch of prisoners up in the same building as the court decided, if we try to escape now, they wouldn't dare to shoot us with all the reporters around and all the spectators. So sure enough, they literally carve a gun out of soap and shoe polish, and they escape. And that's the New York Daily News had the headline, "Oh, Dallas." The other newspapers, "Jailbreak panics Ruby trial is captured in pictures." And then here's the ringleader out of central casting for the thug escaping. The problem is they did escape. They were right. And it's on video. You can see it on YouTube. Nobody shot at them, but then they had no plan. So they're out on the street and they go, what do we do now? So they were pretty quickly recaptured. This is the guilty verdict comes in 2 hours. Belli's psychomotor epilepsy defense did not work. And that's Ruby's sister and his sister Eileen. I think it's one of maybe Marion, and that's Earl, I believe, his kid brother. I could be wrong about which of the siblings these are, but this is right after the verdict. And then ultimately, after 3 years of appeals, a band of lawyers, most famously William Kunstler, gets it overturned, pretty much for the reasons that Belli had tried. So, but Ruby is stricken with cancer and heart disease. Somehow nobody noticed while he was in prison that he was dying, and then he died shortly after the verdict was overturned. This is the Warren Commission report. Obviously controversial, still contested to this day. You got to say, though, I mean, I don't know if it's 888 pages plus 26 volumes of evidence, plus the millions of pages that have been released since. I mean, so this is, you certainly, if anything, it was kind of one of those bamboozle them with bullshit. But there's a lot of, we can talk more about it if anybody, there's hundreds of interviews by the FBI, by the Warren Commission. Why do I have a picture of Mickey Mantle and Gerald Ford and the president of France? Because Mickey Mantle lived next door to Jack Ruby's synagogue, and he himself was a club owner. And Gerald Ford was one of the members of the Warren Commission, which is one of the reasons it was controversial. There were people, including Dulles, who would run the CIA, who were enemies of Kennedy. So there were a lot of reasons people can justifiably shoot holes in the Warren Commission report. But Ford was one of those people who reported that basically Ruby, for all his meekness and craziness and acting out of insanity and jumping under the desk and claiming that he'd started the next Holocaust and he can hear Jews being tortured and then their screams from elsewhere in the building, somehow basically took over the questioning. When he was finally questioned by the Warren Commission, he was like ordering them around and wouldn't talk until Arlen Specter. He wouldn't talk without another Jew in the room until Arlen Specter showed up. Anyway, so from the minute it started, the Warren Commission was contested by people like Mark Lane and hundreds of other people, some crazy, some not. On the other hand, people like Gerald Posner have made their business to defend the Warren Commission. Various movies. Brian Doyle Murray played Ruby in JFK. The Umbrella Academy was a streaming show that came out a couple of years ago on Netflix, set in Dallas. And I forget the actor's name, but I thought he did a pretty good job. I think they captured Ruby pretty well. This is a reporter named Steve North, who worked for Geraldo Rivera and then for a lot of newspapers. Actually, not for so many news, but a lot of TV reporting. And he was very helpful. And he was close both with Rabbi Silverman's family and with Jack Ruby's siblings. That's his sister, Eve, and that is Earl in the lower right, and I think that's Sam in the checkered shirt. This is in a deli in LA in I think in 1989. So this was my approach. I'm not solving the case. Let me get through and figure out who this guy is and was. This is Tammy True during her period of performing and speaking as a veteran and an insider of the assassination. This is a cartridge. This was actually Steve North's bullet. At one point, there was a lot of back and forth about who owned and who had the rights to own the gun. But at a certain point, I don't think the family, but somebody shot 5,000 bullets from Ruby's gun and made it a collectible you could buy. You could probably still buy them. And there is where.
So Danny, do you know anything about Jack Ruby? Just curious.
Not at all. Nothing. I'm just guessing. This is I'm wrapping up, Ken. Sorry. And of course, needless to say, the birth date given on Ruby's headstone is not the birth date he gave anybody when he was alive. It's like a month off. And there's my book. And there's Ken's book.
Thank you.
And that's it. So this is.
Where's Ruby buried? Where is Ruby buried?
Ruby's buried in a cemetery in suburban Chicago. I forget the name of it, but there's been less craziness with his tombstone than with Oswald. There's a whole saga about Lee Harvey Oswald's tombstone.
Well, can you also I have a couple questions here. Actually statements. So can you tell us a little bit about, actually, I see that his name on the tombstone is Jack Ruby, but can you talk a little bit about his actual name?
His name was Jacob Rubenstein. And as which he kept, which his brothers, his sisters, got married, and so they had different names. But he and his brothers all agreed to change their names, I guess, so people wouldn't know they were Jewish. They were in and out of business together, and they were always fighting and stuff and not talking. But at a certain point,
well, let me just. We probably got questions from the audience, and it's a great overview. and there's so many things that you touched on, but there's one thing that I'm curious about if you got a take on it.
Sure.
And then I'd love to find out what you said in the beginning and how you sort of, as a biographer, which I've done, you kind of connect to your subject in a way. How am I like them? How aren't I? Or how are we like them? But before that, in your research or in your setting, to what extent at the time, despite his masterful changing of his name from Rubenstein to Ruby, do you think the fact that he was Jewish was part of the narrative from the very, very early?
It was the main narrative of his whole life. He was very sensitive.
But I mean, from the moment, so do you have any examples of reporting, you know, the day of the shooting, Jack Ruby, Jewish nightclub? I mean, they wouldn't necessarily say that, but or the water cooler conversation, maybe some other people would know, you know, oh, he, you know, he's a Jew, you know what I mean? Like, to what extent was that part of the narrative?
The indictment was the state of Texas against Jacob Rubenstein. And then Wade made a point of apologizing in advance to the rabbi. He said, I did not intend anything anti-Semitic by making it the state versus Jack Rubenstein. But clearly, it seemed to me that was like a neon sign saying this guy is Jewish.
I was going to say, in the pantheon of famous or infamous Jews in America, would you say Jack Ruby is up there?
He's probably, in historical importance, he's probably maybe among the most important. In terms of, say, mob history, he's probably not up there with the Murder Incorporated guys, but not far away. That he was a very contradictory guy. He did have this business. He did have these showbiz aspirations. He had these boxing aspirations.
How did the Jewish community in America, I mean, you could, I guess I had never really thought of it in a way, in a warped way. Yeah, he was heroic. He killed the guy who killed Kennedy. I mean, what did the Jewish?
But no, I think as far as I can tell, it was the opposite. I think, while he did get a lot of congratulatory telegrams, he got a lot of fan mail. And again, maybe there are some people who were older who can tell us. I think it was a great thing of shame. I mean, I think the fact that I didn't know that Jack Ruby was Jewish till I started investigating this like 10 or 15 years ago indicates that this was not something anybody was proud of. Lenny Bruce made. I generally, I'm a big Lenny Bruce fan, but I think Lenny Bruce got it wrong. He sort of talked about Ruby walking up in this kind of, wimpy Jewish way. I don't, if you look at the video or the photos, he walked up in a very bold way, and he almost danced up because he was trained as a boxer, and he moved like the boxer in that, that was I think certainly my journey in this.
Yeah.
I've gone from thinking of the guy as almost almost like Ralph Cramden, but a little more violent, to the moon, Lee Harvey. No, I think he was really a sleazy, disgusting guy, but a fascinating guy. So no,
last question. Last question from me. It's the $6,400 question. Why'd he do it?
You got to read the book. He had a lot of different reasons. Reasons. I mean, and I don't say it just to sell the book. I wouldn't mind selling the book, but I think it's more complicated than it seems, and the reasons he gave changed every day depending on who he was talking to. But I would say, back to your question from a second ago, I think one reason that Rabbi Silverman got involved was really in part to do public relations for the Jews. I think he was really concerned just how bad it would make the Jews look.
That's actually one thing that Ellen Connolly said. She said that Ruby was very concerned that Jews would be blamed for the assassination.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, no, that was part of it. There was an anti-Kennedy ad that ran in the morning news, I think, that day, and it was very critical and very nasty, and signed by Bernard Weissman. and Ruby was convinced that that was a made up name to throw, so that way if anything bad happened to Kennedy, it would be blamed on Jews. And he didn't even think Weissman was real. Oddly enough, Weissman turned out to be a real guy who was a member of a very small group, like him and a bunch of army buddies with a conservative political bent, had put the ad in, but Weissman did come to feel that he was being used by the other guys, specifically to put a Jewish front on it. So although they were kind of anti-Semitic, couldn't be accused of it because they'd have this Bernard Weissman as their beard.
Do you think there was a conspiracy on any end of this, or was it just the idiocy of people in a time before social media?
Again, I'm not trying to weasel out, but there's ample evidence for there being one. But there's no theory that I've read. Not that I've read every theory. Every theory that I've heard or read has this statement, has this clause. It only makes sense that it's only logical that one can only assume. And I see that in the most comprehensive, well-researched, reasonable. So there is this area of doubt. And I also feel that because Ruby and Oswald were both crazy, they make for a great narrative. The question is, were they lone nuts? I have more doubts about Oswald, than I do about Ruby. But obviously, if there's some conspiracy with Oswald, then maybe Ruby is part. But I'm not. I really thought that researching this would clear things up for me, and I find it just makes them foggier, which is why I more and more just went to let's tell the story of this strange, interesting guy, because there's just you get deluged with information, and you get deluged with possible scenarios. I did used to think, like, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, Jack Ruby wanted to be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president, doing a heroic thing, and then he wanted to commit suicide by cop. Because if you've seen Godfather Part 2, where Hyman Roth gets assassinated, and the guy who kills him gets shot immediately. I don't think Ruby had seen it since the movie wasn't made for another 11 years, but I think his life was in a bad place. And I think that's if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president, then die. The more and more I researched it, the less I became convinced.
So what does Danny Fingeroth bring to the most over-researched and most written about thing in the world, except for Albert Einstein, which I'm working on, but we'll talk about that later. What do you bring to it? What's your take?
My take is that
that's a trick question because I think I know, but tell me what you think.
Well, look, what I bring to a lot of stuff, a lot of what I've written about and research about is Jewish Americans of a certain generation, and when I say a certain generation, I mean my parents and aunts and uncles' generation, and so people who, Ruby was not a New York guy, so he's got that certain Chicago thing that I'll never understand because I'm not a Chicago native. That's why I need people like you, or even you specifically, Ken Crimstein, to tell me what Chicago is like, but I don't, but there is that certain thing like, holy cow, the past is not so far away. The past is not so distant.
Danny, sorry to interrupt, but when we first started talking about this, and I asked my mom was at Ruby's brother's wedding because somehow or another he married someone who was like related to his brother married someone who was related to me. So there you go.
Elvin Bell came into the case because of a fellow parent at the Hebrew school that Earl Ruby's kids went to.
So I guess another way of putting it, it's a wonderful biography, and you're a wonderful writer, and we all feel this in our kishkas. And I bet you people in Cleveland know the very same people that look just like Jack Ruby, but they didn't have a gun in their hand, whatever. It was a different time. We're all really, really, really interested in it. Why? Another way of me putting the question is why does just the life of this guy matter? I mean, it's not solving the case.
Yeah.
It's 60 years ago. That's nice, but why? So what?
Well, look, America's always had a healthy conspiracy culture, but I think this really, the Oswald and Ruby situation really turned it up to 11. Maybe now it's up to 1100, but I mean, it was just this thing that, how did that guy get there? And well, we'll never know what Oswald might have said or might have told, or what he meant by "I'm a patsy," or who he was a patsy for. I think, there's a lot of things. And look, I am, as you probably figured out, if you can do math, I'm a baby boomer, so it was this thing that was so weird, it wasn't weird. It was like, oh, well, maybe that's just what happens. Maybe people kill people on, 10 years old. And it's like, oh, maybe presidents get shot and people kill the guy who killed them on TV. Because certainly the next few years, all the other assassinations would certainly have made you think that, well, I guess that's just how life is. People are going to kill people, sometimes on TV. And it just seems to have opened up, there's a lot of things that you can call the opening shot, to pardon the play on words, of the 60s, but that's certainly one of them, I mean, that, and so big that people, so that the absurdest thing is we've had the whole episode of Seinfeld that was like a spoof of the assassination. There was a Saturday Night Live with the assassination of Buckwheat. I mean, people.
So let me ask one final question, and then I'll leave it.
This is like your fifth final question.
I keep saying my fifth final question because but you had an opportunity to work with one Jewish titan, a titan of a pen, titan of the typewriter, Stanley Lieber, who invented Spider-Man, among other things. Were there any? Oh, whatever. Co-invented it. What are details? Not to him. Could you draw any parallels between these two characters? One you got to know, one you didn't. Obviously, as part of the psychological imprint of Danny Fingeroth. Anything there?
Well, I mean, look, the smart ass answer is they both had big years in 1963. That when the height of the Marvel revolution and the Ruby killing Oswald, they were both first generation American born sons of immigrants. Both grew up very poor, both eager for attention, really both in show business, whatever else drove Ruby, I think, so maybe that they both had that American dream of becoming famous. You saw that, that photo of Ruby basically doing stand-up at his club. That was what Stan Lee ultimately was. Really, he was a comedian and raconteur. But I mean, look, obviously there were great differences. Stan had one sibling, and until he was 9, he was an only child. So although they were poor, he still had a lot of attention and whatever. I don't think, as dysfunctional as Stan's family was, I don't think it was as bad as Jack Ruby's background. So I don't, I think there are some surface things, and it is interesting that they both helped shape the culture of the 60s and got us to our modern era. But I don't really think they had a lot in common. I think that would, it's a funny question, and but yeah, I think they were pretty different.
But as a cultural historian, they were part of the same kind of era as
well, they were, and I mean, and look, that was an interesting. I mean, there were John F. Kennedy showed up a lot in Marvel Comics, and just in a cameo, whatever I have to go. He'd be in a rocking chair and he would, speak about pursuing things with bigger. and then he gets killed, and then the next month, then Lyndon Johnson is just, if a story needs a president, it was too much at that point. Maybe 10 years later, Stan Lee was ready to engage and be a public figure and comment on current events. But the interest, Stan has a story that he used to like to do comics. He used to like take movie stills and put funny captions and word balloons. And he did it a lot with Kennedy, because Kennedy was so popular. It was the height of the Camelot era. And Stan has a set story he tell all the time, that there was an issue going out of I think it was called You Don't Say, was the name of the magazine. And it went to the printers just as the assassination happened. And his story was that he called back he called back and had them trash all the copies because it was too disrespectful. But I think, especially given the nature of magazine distribution, you can find that magazine, and there's a lot of copies on eBay. But it is interesting that Stan, whether intuitively or consciously, did try to at least tie himself and Marvel into the times that way. By contrast, when I was researching down at the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas, they interview a lot of people. They interviewed me, weirdly enough, but they have hundreds of interviews with people who were somehow connected to the culture. And I thought, oh boy, I bet Stan Lee would love to be interviewed and be in the archives here. And but I called him, and he said he didn't want to do it. I thought that was interesting. That I don't know what line that was in Stan's mind, that he wouldn't do it, but he did not want to be interviewed and in the archives. So, somehow, like everybody who lived then, he was very much affected by what went on.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you at this point,
Sure.
just to see if there are any questions from the audience. I know that Ellen Connolly has you've covered a lot of the things that she had mentioned in here.
Ellen, what did I get wrong? Tell me off. Tell me off.
Well, a
Off
couple
screen
things that she
sometime.
did say. She said that Bernard Weissman signed the ad and that she actually met Bernard Weissman.
Wow.
Um, but she concurred with a lot of the things that you said. But any other questions that does the audience want to put in the chat? So let's just give them just a minute. You guys can keep chatting if you want, just to give people a few minutes to um, see if there's any questions. But I will tell you, Danny, I think, the whole conspiracy thing will live on and on and on and on forever.
Yeah. No, even if they, no one will ever believe that they released all the documents, even if they were to release all the documents. No, of course it won't. There's so much. It does make. I mean, there's so many. There's a guy named Andre Kojescu who's got a podcast. A lot of you may know him from NPR, his commentaries over the years and from his poetry. He's got
Yep.
a podcast, and he's written a play that I just went to see last night, where he focuses actually on a guy named Kerry Thornley, who was a Marine who served with Oswald and wrote a novel about Oswald before Oswald shot Kennedy. So there's so many bizarre characters and occurrences. I mean, you can almost, I mean, the truth is definitely stranger than fiction in a lot of this. And, what I don't want to do is trivialize it. I don't want to make, it's obviously important. It's obviously a lot of where we are today. So I don't want to just make it like, oh, here's some wacky stories. I think it is important, but I just felt like my story to tell was about Ruby.
Well, actually, one question I do have is, if you could give us the title of the book again, and
It's called. Wait, I can even show you the book.
I think that would be wonderful if you could show us the book.
It's
I'm
called.
not getting.
It is called Jack Ruby: The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. It's put out by Chicago Review Press. it doesn't officially come out till the 21st, but I think there's a lot of stores that will have it, and you can certainly pre-order it. And you know, and I did the audio book. So if you liked this, imagine 14 hours.
Yeah.
Well,
So
Danny, I'm not getting any questions.
I guess I've answered all. I guess I've answered all the loose ends about the Kennedy assassination. That must be
Well,
it.
I think also like you're doing is like I think you're giving us a little bit of, a little bit of a teaser there so that we can read the book and we can, see what your thinking was and some of the things that Ken asked and you were a little cagey about answering. So I think that I think it'll be, um, a good read, and I'm
And
looking forward to. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting the book and talking to Ellen Connolly about the book. I'm sure she will have some comments.
I did want to mention that Ken and I are both available for interior decorating if you like our backgrounds.
Yeah.
It's called
Yeah,
Book
right.
Chic. Ken, do you have
Basement model.
any other anything you want to add?
I just think it's you know, to take a character like this in a time like this, which is, and that's why I was leaning in so much in the beginning, because I think for people under boomer age, uh, to even understand the world that of Jewish nightclub owners and police, this type of everything was in public. Danny and I were talking about it in New York. I mean, if you think back to 1964 when the Beatles first came to America, if you look at some of the footage, they're moving their own gear around on the stage. I mean, this was not the professional slick world that we are so accustomed to. It was like TV cameras were new. A lot of things were, they didn't know what they were doing. And I wonder myself if, you know, anything like this could happen now, but it does happen now, but it happens in different ways. But I think Danny's captured such an important moment in time. And when he's kind of saying this is a template for the 60s, I mean, forget the conspiracy theory, back into the left, whatever. That's always fun. I think Dan's picked up on a moment in time which will never ever come again. You could walk up to the White House and knock on the window and wave at the press. It was a different era.
And it was very. I mean, I lived through it, but I was a little kid. But it was so disorienting and so weird. Even I guess for adults, right? I mean, there were. It's very very interesting that between Lincoln and Kennedy, there were two other presidential assassinations that nobody ever talks about. So in a way, it had happened, 4 times in 100 years. But for us, especially for me as a kid, it was so disorienting and so bizarre that it was almost too big to deal with, and why I didn't even try dealing with it really till 10 or 12 years ago.
And there's your character right at the center of it. So it's a great take on a really important time. Yeah.
Well, I think that you've captured the essence, both of you, and I appreciate you being with us and having this conversation. And I will look forward to our next conversation with a center on. I think he's already smiling when he's thinking about comics. So I think that'll be our next topic, and I want to thank everybody for either being with us virtually or being with us in the auditorium. And I just want to say, have a great afternoon. Here it's sunny. I hope it's sunny where you are, and you guys all take care.